1,000 locked doors. Behind each one, a girl was stolen from home, dressed in silk, and told she now belonged to the Sultan's midnight appetites. The Ottoman harem was no romantic palace of luxury. It was a gilded prison where lust, politics, and paranoia collided. Eunuchs with knives stood guard, while whispers of betrayal ended in silk cords around trembling throats. Tonight, we're peeling back the velvet curtains to expose the grotesque secrets of Ottoman intimacy, where power was measured not in crowns or coins, but in who shared the Sultan's bed. The kidnapped virgins, imagine the sound of hooves in the night, doors kicked open, girls dragged from warm beds while fathers begged and mothers clawed at soldiers' boots. This wasn't war, it was harvest. The Ottomans collected beauty the way farmers gathered wheat. Blonde hair, pale skin, wide eyes, exotic trophies meant to decorate the Sultan's cage. They were marched for miles, shackled in silence, told that paradise awaited. Instead, paradise meant a velvet dungeon called the Harem. Once inside, the humiliation began. Virginity inspections, as polite historians phrase it, were rituals closer to torture than medicine. Old matrons and eunuchs poked, prodded, and whispered judgments, reducing terrified teenagers to livestock statistics. A single blemish, and you were cast aside as damaged goods. A perfect score. Congratulations, you had won the privilege of slavery dressed in silk. Some were told fairy tales. You could become queen, maybe even sway an empire. But most quickly learned the truth. The harem wasn't a path to power. It was a machine, and girls were its fuel. A machine that chewed innocence and spat out silence. And once the doors closed behind them, there was no going back, because the next set of guards weren't men at all, they were shadows with knives, the eunuch enforcers. If the kidnapped virgins were the harem's fuel, the eunuchs were its mechanics, twisted, broken men whose very bodies had been turned into instruments of control. The castration wasn't clean. It was crude surgery with a knife heated in fire, a bucket of water, and the faint hope the victim wouldn't bleed out on the floor. The survivors were half men, their voices thin, their futures stolen, their loyalty bought through mutilation, their task, to guard the Sultan's women like treasure locked in a vault. No man but the Sultan could touch them, so these eunuchs became living locks on the palace doors. They prowled the corridors like vultures, listening for whispers, sniffing for forbidden lovers, even performing invasive purity checks when ordered. Imagine your fate resting in the hands of a man with a scar, where his manhood used to be loyal only because he'd been butchered. But don't mistake their silence for pity. Eunuchs could be cruel, even sadistic, finding twisted satisfaction in humiliating the girls they controlled. They were both prisoners and wardens, broken bodies wielding unbroken knives. And if a concubine dared to test the limits, the punishment was never subtle, because the Sultan's appetites weren't the only games played at midnight. The Sultan's midnight games. When the palace went dark, the real theatre began. The Sultan's chambers weren't bedrooms, they were stages, set for nightly performances of power disguised as pleasure. Exotic foods were piled high, oysters, figs, honey-drenched lamb, not for feasting, but for fueling what came next. Aphrodisiacs flowed like wine-powdered pearls, crushed rhino horn, even gold leaf, because apparently nothing says romance like eating your own currency. The concubines weren't lovers. They were actors in grotesque plays choreographed by a restless tyrant. Some sultans demanded role-play, forcing women to dress as slaves, soldiers, even animals. Others made intimacy into sport, concubines wrestling naked on polished marble floors while eunuchs watched, ready to drag away the losers. For the Sultan, it wasn't about desire, it was about domination, a reminder that he could command bodies as easily as armies. And when a woman fell out of favor, she was dismissed like spoiled meat, banished to the old concubine wing, or quietly drowned in the Bosporus. History calls these women favorites. But favorites in the Ottoman palace lasted about as long as a glass of spilled wine, and the stakes got higher, because in the harem, love could crown you or kill your child before sunrise. The deadly competition. In the harem, survival wasn't about beauty, it was about breeding. A concubine's only path to power was bearing the Sultan a son, and that turned the palace into a gladiator pit disguised in silk. Every birth was a battlefield, every cradle a coffin waiting to happen. Concubines plotted like assassins. Rumors swirl of newborns smothered with silk pillows before they could draw a second breath. Rival mothers poisoned each other with perfume bottles laced in toxins, or served sherbet sweetened with arsenic. The prize? To become Valid Sultan, the mother of the future ruler, wielding power that rivaled viziers and generals. But the risk? Everything. One misstep, and you could be strangled at dawn, your body rolled into a carpet and tossed into the river. Even the children weren't safe. Brothers were often pitted against one another, forced into a deadly contest where only one son could live to inherit. Imagine nursery rhymes sung over the sound of executions in the courtyard below. This wasn't a family, it was a factory for paranoia, and as for the Sultan himself sometimes, even his appetite strayed into nightmares no rivalry could prepare for. The Sultan's favourite horror. Every Sultan had his peculiar kink, but some turned the harem into something closer to a madhouse. One ruler demanded boys be dressed as concubines, painted and perfumed, then paraded like grotesque dolls for his entertainment. Another staged orgies as political theatre, inviting his viziers to watch as if intimacy itself were state propaganda. The palace wasn't just a bedroom, it was a carnival of cruelty, where pleasure was spectacle and humiliation was policy. And then came the drownings. One sultan, upon discovering an affair between his women and palace guards, ordered the entire harem, hundreds of girls, to be tied in sacks and tossed into the Bosporus. A single indiscretion became a mass grave beneath the waves. Still others forced concubines to wrestle naked on marble floors, betting on the winners like gladiators in a private coliseum. Desire warped into death matches, where a sultan's amusement dictated survival. For all the perfumes, silks and jewels, the harem wasn't a paradise of love. It was a stage for nightmares, a place where one man's fantasies meant hundreds of women's funerals, and when the curtains finally closed, the empire remembered its rulers as great. But the concubines? They were erased. The Ottomans built empires with armies and cannons, but their palaces hid a darker battlefield. Behind jeweled curtains, power was measured in intimacy, betrayal, and survival. For every sultan remembered in marble, there were hundreds of nameless women whose blood slicked the palace floors. Their stories weren't written in history books. They were whispered in silk corridors and silenced by eunuchs' blades. So next time someone paints the harem as exotic romance, remember, it was less Arabian Nights, more a horror anthology of sex, politics, and strangulation.